In the sun-drenched vineyards of St. Emilian's, a charming vintner raises a glass of his finest wine at a lively festival, unaware it's laced with deadly cyanide. When he collapses, the village is plunged into a web of suspicion. Enter Miss Jane Marple, a sharp-eyed spinster whose gentle demeanor hides a razor-sharp mind, as she unravels the secrets of a jealous rival. A distant wife, a prideful sommelier, and a scheming investor. Only one truth emerges: ambition can poison more than wine. Will Miss Marple's quiet wisdom catch a killer before they strike again? Dive into the poisoned wine, a tale of betrayal and brilliance. Chapter 1. The festival of the village of St. Emilian's lay nestled in a gentle valley. Its stone cottages, glowing amber in the late August sun. The annual wine festival had transformed the sleepy square into a tapestry of color and sound. Barrels gleamed under striped awnings, fiddles sang from a makeshift stage, and the air carried the rich perfume of grape and oak. Villagers and visitors alike swirled glasses of ruby and gold, their laughter rising like bubbles in a flute of champagne. At the heart of it all stood Vincent Moreau, vintner of Chateau Lyrac, his broad shoulders and easy grin commanding the crowd's affection. His winery's marquee, draped in crimson, bore the crest of his celebrated label. And today he was king of the revels. Miss Jane Marple, seated at a small iron table beneath a linden tree, observed the scene with her characteristic stillness. Her pale blue eyes, bright despite her years, flickered over the throng as her knitting needles clicked a steady rhythm. She had arrived in St. Emilian's at the insistence of her dear friend, Mrs. Clara Bantry, who had declared the festival just the thing for a change of air. Miss Marple, ever obliging, had packed her shawl and her sharpest curiosity, suspecting that even the most charming villages hid their secrets. Now, as she sipped a modest glass of lemonade wine, she felt was best left to the experts. She noted the undercurrents beneath the festival's gaiety. Vincent Moreau raised a glass of his finest Chateau Lyrac, a deep claret that caught the sunlight like a jewel. To St. Emilian's, he called, his voice warm and resonant, and to the vines that bind us. The crowd cheered, glasses clinking in a wave of goodwill. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on those nearest Vincent. His wife, Elise, stood at his side, her elegant figure clad in pale silk. But her smile seemed to Miss Marple a touch too fixed, as though painted on for the occasion. Nearby, Henry Dubois, a rival vintner, leaned against a barrel, his eyes narrowed as Vincent basked in applause. Paul Garnier, Vincent's sommelier, hovered with a decanter, his movements precise but his expression unreadable, and at the edge of the marquee, Charles Leland, a sleek investor from the city, watched with a smile that Miss Marple thought a shade too calculating. Vincent brought the glass to his lips, savoring the wine with a showman's flourish. The crowd hushed, awaiting his verdict on the vintage. For a moment, his face glowed with satisfaction. Then, abruptly, his hand faltered. The glass slipped, shattering on the cobbled ground. Vincent clutched his throat, his eyes wide with shock, and staggered forward. A woman screamed as he crumpled to the ground, his ruddy cheeks draining to ash. The fiddles faltered, and the crowd surged, only to freeze as a local doctor, Dr. Haydock, pushed through. Kneeling beside Vincent, he pressed fingers to his wrist, then shook his head gravely. "He's gone," he said, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. Miss Marple's needles paused, her hands still in her lap. She watched as Elise knelt beside her husband, her face pale but composed, her hands trembling only slightly. Henry Dubois turned away, his jaw tight. Paul Garnier set down the decanter with exaggerated care, as though distancing himself from the scene. Charles Leland melted into the crowd, his absence as conspicuous to Miss Marple as his earlier presence. A murmur rippled through the onlookers. Poison, some whispered, for what else could strike so swiftly? Inspector Craddock, summoned from the nearby town, arrived with his men, cordoning off the marquee. As the festival dissolved into whispers and suspicion, Miss Marple tucked her knitting into her bag. Human nature, she reflected, was never so predictable as when it turned to murder. Chapter 2. The Suspects. The morning after Vincent Moreau's death dawned over St. Emilian's with a deceptive calm, as though the village sought to reclaim its serenity from the chaos of the festival. The sun filtered through the leaves of ancient elms, casting dappled shadows on the cobbled square, now stripped of its barrels and bunting. A faint tense of spilt wine lingered in the air, a ghostly reminder of the previous day's tragedy. Miss Jane Marple sat in the parlor of Mrs. Clara Bantry's rented cottage, a modest stone house on the edge of the village, its windows open to the scent of lavender from the garden. Her knitting lay folded in her lap, untouched for once, as she sipped a cup of Earl Grey and listened to Inspector Craddock's measured report. The inspector, a man of steady temperament and sharp instincts, had arrived early, his notebook bristling with notes from the night's inquiries. Mrs. Bantry, bustling about with a tray of scones, cast anxious glances at her friend, sensing that Miss Marple's quiet demeanor masked a mind already at work. "Poison, Miss Marple," Craddock said, his voice low but firm. "Cyanide, to be precise. The coroner's preliminary report came in an hour ago. It was in the wine Vincent drank his own chateau. Lilac, no less. A particularly cruel touch, don't you think?" He adjusted his spectacles, a habit Miss Marple had noted in their past encounters, and flipped a page in his notebook. The bottle was from his private stock, reserved for the festival toast. Someone tampered with it, and they knew exactly what they were doing. Miss Marple's eyes, bright and birdlike, met his. "Cyanide is so very personal, Inspector," she remarked, setting her cup down with a delicate clink. "It requires not just intent but opportunity and a certain intimacy with the victim's habits. One doesn't simply slip poison into a glass at a crowded festival without being noticed." "Quite so," Craddock agreed, leaning forward. "Which is why we've narrowed it down to 4 suspects, each with motive and means, or so it seems. I'd value your thoughts, Miss Marple. You've a knack for seeing what others miss." His tone held a trace of admiration, tempered by the professional reserve of a man who preferred facts to intuition. Mrs. Bantry, unable to contain herself, plopped onto the sofa, her floral dress rustling. "Oh, Jane, it's dreadful. Vincent was such a charming man, and now this. Poison at a wine festival, why, it's like something out of a novel. Who are these suspects, Inspector? Do tell." Craddock cleared his throat, glancing at Miss Marple, who gave a small nod, her lips curving into a faint, encouraging smile. "Very well," he began. "First, there's Henry Dubois, a rival vintner. His winery, Les Vins Dubois, has been struggling for years while Vincent's Chateau Larac soared. There's bad blood, their professional jealousy, I'd wager, and possibly more. Dubois was at the festival, though he claims he was manning his own stall when Vincent collapsed." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. "Jealousy is a powerful thing, Inspector. In my village, St. Mary Mead, there was a gardener, Mr. Phipps, who grew splendid roses. When young Tommy Pierce won a prize over him at the flower show, Mr. Phipps was quite put out. Nothing came of it, of course, but I've seen how envy can curdle into something darker." Craddock nodded, jotting a note. "Next is Elise Moreau, Vincent's wife. A striking woman, but cold, if you ask me. She didn't shed a tear when we informed her of his death, just stood there, pale as marble, and asked about the vineyards. Accounts. There's talk in the village of strain in their marriage. Vincent spent all his time with the vines, leaving her to play hostess alone. And there's a whisper of her spending evenings with a local artist, Marcel Fournier." Mrs. Bantry gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "An affair? Oh, Jane, how scandalous. Do you think she could have poisoned him out of spite?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her tone remained gentle. "We mustn't jump to conclusions, Clara dear, a woman neglected is not always a woman vengeful. But it's worth noting, Inspector, that a wife knows her husband's habits best. The wine he drank, was it poured from a bottle she might have handled? Craddock frowned. Possibly. The bottle came from the winery's cellar, and Elise had access to the house and grounds. She was near Vincent during the toast, though witnesses say she stepped away just before he drank. Interesting, Miss Marple murmured, her fingers brushing the edge of her saucer. And the third suspect, Paul Garnier, Vincent's sommelier, Craddock continued. A fastidious man, almost obsessive about the wines. He's been with Chateau Lyrac for years, but there's talk he felt undervalued. Vincent was the face of the winery, while Garnier did the real work, or so he believed. He selected the bottle for the festival and poured the wine himself. If anyone could tamper with it unnoticed, it's him. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Pride in one's work can be a dangerous thing when it's slighted. I recall a housekeeper in St. Mary Mead, Mrs. Copling, who took great offense when her employer praised another's cooking. She didn't poison anyone, mind you, but she left in quite a huff. A sommelier, so close to the wine, would have every opportunity. And finally, Craddock said, his voice taking on a graver note, Charles Leland, a London investor. He's been bankrolling Chateau Lyrac's expansion, but he and Vincent had a falling out. Leland wanted to buy the vineyard outright, turn it into some modern operation. Vincent refused, and their last meeting ended in a shouting match, according to the winery staff. Leland was at the festival, though his whereabouts during the toast are unclear. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her eyes wide. A businessman with a grudge. Jane, he sounds positively ruthless. Do you think he'd stoop to murder? Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic. Ambition, Clara, can be as deadly as envy or betrayal. A man like Mr. Leland might see a vineyard as a prize worth any cost. But we must be careful. People are so very predictable, yet so surprising, when their desires are at stake. Craddock closed his notebook with a snap. That's the lot. 4 suspects, each with a reason to want Vincent dead. The wine was poisoned before it reached the glass. We're certain of that. The bottle was sealed, but cyanide could have been added in the cellar, or even earlier. We're testing everything, but it's a slow business. Miss Marple, you've dealt with cases like this before. Any thoughts? Miss Marple folded her hands, her gaze drifting to the window where a blackbird hopped along the garden path. It's always the why that matters, Inspector, she said softly. The how is important, of course, but the why tells you who. Each of these people had access to Vincent's world, his wine, his home, his dreams. But only one had a reason strong enough to act. I think, perhaps, a little observation might help us see the pattern. Mrs. Bantry clapped her hands. Oh, Jane, you're going to poke about, aren't you? I knew this holiday would turn into one of your adventures. Miss Marple's lips twitched. I shall merely take an interest, Clara. A walk through the village, a chat with the locals. It's surprising what one learns when one listens. Craddock stood, adjusting his hat. I'll keep you informed, Miss Marple. If you hear anything, you'll let me know. Of course, Inspector, she replied, her tone as mild as her tea. People do talk, you know, and they say such revealing things. As Craddock departed, Mrs. Bantry turned to her friend, her face alight with curiosity. Where will you start, Jane? The wife? The rival? Oh, it's all so thrilling. Miss Marple picked up her knitting, her needles resuming their gentle rhythm. I think, Clara, I shall begin with a stroll to the festival square. The scene of a crime is like a stage, you see. The players leave their marks, even when they think no one is watching. The square was quieter now, the festive chaos replaced by an eerie stillness. A few villagers lingered, whispering over cups of coffee at the cafe. their eyes darting to the spot where Vincent had fallen. Miss Marple, her straw hat tilted against the sun, walked slowly past the empty marquee, its crimson drapes sagging like a mourner's veil. She paused by the stone fountain, where a waiter from the festival was sweeping up broken glass. He was a young man, no more than 20, with a nervous air and a habit of glancing over his shoulder. "Good morning," Miss Marple said, her voice warm and disarming. "Such a sad business yesterday. Were you working when poor Mr. Moreau took ill?" The waiter, whose name was Etienne, nodded, his broom pausing. "Yes, mademoiselle. I was serving at the Chateau Lirac tent. It was awful, everyone cheering, then him falling like that. I still can't believe it." Miss Marple's eyes softened, though they missed nothing. "You must have seen so much, being right there. Did you notice anything unusual? Anyone near Mr. Moreau's wine, perhaps?" Etienne hesitated, then lowered his voice. "I shouldn't say, but I saw Monsieur Garnier, the sommelier, bring the bottle from the cellar. He was very particular about it, said it was the best vintage. And Madame Moreau, she was there, but she left just before the toast. I thought she looked upset, but maybe that's just how she is." Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. "And the others? Monsieur Dubois, or perhaps Mr. Leland?" Etienne's eyes widened. Monsieur Dubois was nearby, talking to some customers, but he kept looking over at Monsieur Moreau's tent. "As for Monsieur Leland, I didn't see him much, but he was in and out of the marquee all day. He's not like the others, too fancy for St. Emilions, if you ask me." "Thank you, Etienne," Miss Marple said, slipping him a small coin from her purse. "You've been most helpful." She moved on, her steps slow but purposeful, her mind turning over the waiter's words. The square offered other voices: a flower seller who recalled Elise's distracted air, a baker who swore Henry Dubois had muttered something bitter about Vincent's success, and an old woman who had seen Leland adjusting his cufflinks near the tent, his face unreadable. Each fragment was a thread, and Miss Marple, with her quiet patience, was already weaving them together. Back at the cottage, Mrs. Bantry greeted her with a fresh pot of tea and a barrage of questions. "Well, Jane, did you find anything? Is it the wife?" "Oh, I bet it's her." Miss Marple smiled, settling into her chair. "It's early days, Clara, but I will say this. People are never quite what they seem, even in a village as charming as this one. There's a pattern here, and I mean to find it." As the afternoon waned, Miss Marple opened her notebook, not unlike Craddock's, though smaller and bound in faded leather, and jotted down her observations. Henry's envy, Elise's detachment, Paul's pride, Leland's ambition was a motive, but only one fit the precise cruelty of cyanide in a vintner's own wine. She closed the notebook, her thoughts drifting to St. Mary Mead, and the countless small dramas that had taught her the ways of the human heart. Murder, she knew, was never just about death. It was about desire, and desire always left a trace. Chapter 3. The rival's envy of the sun hung low over St. Emilions, painting the rolling vineyards in hues of gold and crimson as Miss Jane Marple made her way along a dusty path toward Les Vins du Bois, the winery of Henry Dubois. The air was thick with the scent of ripening grapes, and the distant hum of a tractor underscored the quiet industry of the harvest. Miss Marple, her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel, carried a small basket of wildflowers, a pretext for her visit. She had learned long ago in St. Mary Mead that a gentle gesture could open doors and lips more effectively than any official inquiry. Her straw hat shaded her eyes, which sparkled with the keen alertness of a woman who missed nothing, from the flutter of a curtain to the flicker of a lie. Les Vins du Bois was a modest affair compared to the grandeur of Chateau Lirac, its stone buildings, weathered by time, huddled around a courtyard where barrels were stacked haphazardly, some bearing the scars of neglect. A sign, faded but proud, announced the winery's name, though its letters peeled at the edges. Miss Marple paused to admire a row of vines, their leaves curling in the late summer heat, and noted the absence of the polished order she had seen at Vincent's estate. Here, ambition battled with limitation, and the contrast told a story of its own. Henry Dubois emerged from a low-roofed tasting room, wiping his hands on a stained apron. He was a stocky man in his late 40s, with a weathered face and eyes that carried the weight of too many lean seasons. His dark hair was streaked with gray, and his movements had the deliberate care of someone who had learned to conserve energy. When he saw Miss Marple, his expression shifted from surprise to a guarded courtesy, though his smile did not reach his eyes. "Good afternoon, monsieur," Miss Marple said, her voice soft and disarming, as though she were merely a visitor charmed by the countryside. "I hope I'm not intruding. I was out walking and couldn't resist seeing your vineyard. These flowers are for you, a small token from the village." Henry took the basket, his calloused fingers brushing the petals with a flicker of suspicion. "Kind of you, mademoiselle," he said, his accent thick with the cadence of St. Emilian's. "But we don't get many visitors here, not like at Chateau Lirac." The name carried a bite, and Miss Marple noted the way his jaw tightened, as though the words were sour on his tongue. "Oh, I'm sure your wines are delightful," she replied, her tone bright but laced with just enough flattery to ease his guard. "I've heard such good things about Les Vangs du Bois, though I understand it's been a challenging season. Competition must be fierce with a man like Vincent Moreau setting the standard." Henry's eyes darkened, and he gestured for her to follow him into the tasting room. The interior was dim, its walls lined with shelves of bottles, their labels less ornate than those of Chateau Lirac. A single wooden table stood in the center, flanked by mismatched chairs, and a faint musty scent clung to the air. Henry poured a glass of his red, a deep burgundy that lacked the luster of Vincent's famed vintage. "Try this," he said, pushing the glass toward her. "It's honest wine, made with honest work. Not like Vincent's, more show than substance." Miss Marple took a delicate sip, her expression one of polite appreciation, though her mind was elsewhere. "Very robust," she said, setting the glass down. "You must be proud of your craft. It's such a pity, though, about poor Monsieur Moreau. I was at the festival when it happened. So shocking. You were there too, I believe." Henry leaned against the table, his arms crossed. "I was," he said curtly, "at my own stall, pouring for customers. I didn't see Vincent fall, but I heard the commotion. A bad business, but not my concern." His tone was dismissive. Yet Miss Marple caught the slight tremor in his hand as he adjusted a bottle on the shelf. "Of course," she said, her voice soothing. "It must be difficult, though, with Chateau Lirac drawing so much attention. I imagine it's hard for a man of your skill to compete with such a theatrical rival." Henry's laugh was short and bitter. "Theatrical is right. Vincent was no vintner. He was a performer. All charm and no depth. He'd parade his awards, flaunt his sales, while the rest of us scrabbled for scraps. His wines weren't better, just louder." He paused, catching himself, and his eyes narrowed. "But I didn't kill him, if that's what you're thinking. I've got enough troubles without adding murder to them." Miss Marple's smile remained serene, though her mind catalogued his words. "Oh, I wouldn't dream of suggesting such a thing," she said. "But it's curious, isn't it, how envy can stir people up? In my village, St. Mary Mead, there was a baker, Mr. Finch, who took it hard when a newcomer's bread won praise at the fair. He didn't do anything drastic, of course, but he was ever so cross. It's human nature, I suppose." Henry's gaze flickered, as though weighing her words. "Envy's one thing," he said at last. "Poison's another. I don't hold with that. If I wanted to best Vincent, I'd do it with my wine, not some coward's trick." Miss Marple nodded, her fingers brushing the edge of her shawl. "Quite so," And yet, someone at the festival had other ideas. You must have seen so much, being there all day. Did you notice anyone near Vincent's tent, perhaps someone who shouldn't have been? Henry hesitated, his eyes darting to the window, where a worker was loading barrels onto a cart. I was busy, he said, but I saw Paul Garnier fussing over Vincent's bottles, as usual, and that investor Leland was sniffing around talking to the staff. He's got no business near the vines, if you ask me. As for Elise Moreau, she was there 1 minute, gone the next. Never liked her too cold for a vintner's wife. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of innocent curiosity. How interesting. And you, monsieur? Did you have a chance to visit Vincent's stall, perhaps to compare notes? Henry's face hardened. I stayed at my own tent. I've no time for Vincent's games. But his voice faltered, and Miss Marple noted the way his fingers gripped the table, as though anchoring himself against her gentle probing. They spoke a little longer, Miss Marple steering the conversation to the weather and the harvest, her questions as light as the breeze. Henry relaxed slightly, offering her another glass of wine, which she declined with a smile. As she took her leave, thanking him for the flower's welcome, she paused at the door. One last thing, monsieur, she said, her tone almost apologetic. I saw a photograph in the village cafe, a lovely picture of you and Vincent at last year's festival, both smiling with your awards. You must have been friends once. Henry's expression softened, then clouded. Once, he admitted, before he decided he was better than the rest of us. That award, he flaunted it, like a crown. I haven't spoken to him in months. He turned away, busying himself with a crate, and Miss Marple knew the conversation was over, as she walked back to the village. The vineyard stretching out like a green sea on either side, Miss Marple's mind sifted through Henry's words. His bitterness was palpable, a resentment honed by years of watching Vincent's star rise while his own dimmed. Envy, she knew, could be a slow poison, eating away at a man's restraint until it spilled over into action. Yet Henry's bluntness, his almost defiant honesty, gave her pause. A murderer, she thought, often hid behind a smoother mask. Back at Mrs. Bantry's cottage, the afternoon light spilled through the parlor windows, warming the chintz cushions. Mrs. Bantry was waiting, her eyes bright with anticipation. Well, Jane, was he dreadful? Did he confess? She asked, pouring tea with a flourish. Miss Marple settled into her chair, her knitting resuming its familiar rhythm. Henry Dubois is a man with a grievance, Clara, she said. His pride is wounded, and Vincent's success was a thorn in his side. But whether that thorn drove him to murder, I'm not yet certain. People are so very revealing when they speak of their rivals, don't you think? Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her cup forgotten. Oh, Jane, you're teasing me, do you think? He did it. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. I think, Clara, that Henry Dubois has a heart full of grudges. But a grudge alone doesn't pour cyanide into a bottle. We must look closer at his movements, his opportunities, and what others saw that day. There's a pattern here, and I mean to find it. As the sun dipped below the hills, casting long shadows over St. Emilian's, Miss Marple opened her small notebook and added a few lines about Henry Dubois. His envy was clear, but was it sharp enough to kill? She closed the book, her thoughts already turning to Elise Moreau, whose cool composure held secrets of its own. Chapter 4. The wife's secret. The morning mist clung to the vineyards of St. Emilian's, softening the outlines of the stone walls and gnarled vines that stretched toward the horizon. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in a light shawl against the early chill, walked the short distance from Mrs. Bantry's cottage to the grand gates of Chateau Lyrac. The estate loomed ahead, its chateau a vision of pale stone and tall windows, surrounded by manicured gardens that spoke of wealth and care. Yet there was a stillness about the place, as though the house itself mourned its master. Miss Marple's purpose was clear: to call on Elise Moreau, Vincent's widow, under the guise of offering condolences. In her handbag, nestled beside her knitting, was a small card of sympathy. But her true intent was to observe the woman whose composure at the festival had struck her as oddly impenetrable. The gravel drive crunched under her feet as she approached. The entrance, where a maid, young and nervous, admitted her with a curtsy. "Madame is in the drawing-room," the girl murmured, leading Miss Marple through a hall adorned with portraits of stern-faced Moros, their eyes following her progress. The drawing-room was a study in elegance. Silk curtains framed tall windows. A crystal chandelier gleamed softly, and a grand piano stood in one corner, its lid closed. Elise Moreau sat on a velvet chaise, her dark hair swept into a chignon, her black dress tailored with a precision that seemed more suited to a gala than a widow's grief. She rose as Miss Marple entered, her movements graceful but measured, like a dancer performing a role she knew by heart. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to call," Elise said, her voice smooth but devoid of warmth. She gestured to a chair, and Miss Marple settled into it, her hands folded neatly over her handbag. "I'm afraid I'm not myself today. The shock, you understand." "Of course," Miss Marple replied, her tone soft with sympathy. "It was such a dreadful thing, at the festival of all places. I brought a small note of condolence. Much, but we, in St. Mary Mead, always try to offer comfort in times of loss." She handed Elise the card, her eyes noting the widow's slender fingers, which accepted it without a tremble. Elise glanced at the card, her lips curving into a faint smile that did not reach her eyes. "You're very thoughtful," she said, setting it on a side table. "Vincent would have appreciated it. He was so fond of the village, you know, even if his heart was always with the vines." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of gentle interest. "He was quite the figure at the festival, so full of life. It must be terribly hard for you, managing the estate alone now. I imagine you and he were very close, sharing such a grand venture as Chateau Lyrac." Elise's gaze flickered, and she smoothed her dress, a small gesture that Miss Marple noted as deliberate. "We were happy, in our way," she said. "Vincent was devoted to the vineyard. It was his true love, I sometimes thought. I managed the household, the accounts, the social side of things. It kept us busy, perhaps too busy." Her voice was even, but there was a brittleness to it, like porcelain that might crack under pressure. Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes soft but searching. "It's a great deal for one person to manage, especially with so many eyes on the winery's success. I couldn't help but notice how composed you were at the festival, even after what happened. It speaks to a remarkable strength." Elise's fingers tightened briefly on the arm of the chaise. "One does what one must," she said. "Vincent would have hated a scene. I wanted to honor that, even in such a moment." She paused, then added, "The police had been here, asking questions. I told them I was with Vincent until just before the toast, when I stepped away to speak to a guest. I didn't see anything unusual." Miss Marple nodded, her knitting needles clicking softly as she drew them from her bag, more for comfort than necessity. "It's so difficult to make sense of such a tragedy," she said. "In my village, St. Mary Mead, we had a case, once a young wife, much admired, whose husband died suddenly. There was talk of her being too friendly with a neighbor, but it turned out to be nothing more than village gossip. People do love to talk, don't they?" Elise's eyes narrowed slightly, though her smile remained. "They do," she agreed, "and they say such foolish things. Vincent and I had our differences, like any couple, but I loved him. If you're referring to Marcel Fournier, the artist, it's nonsense. He's painted my portrait, nothing more." Miss Marple's needles paused, her expression one of mild surprise. "Oh, I hadn't meant anyone in particular," she said, her voice apologetic. "But it's good to clear up such misunderstandings. Gossip can be so unkind, and you were so busy at the festival, Did you happen to see anyone near Vincent's wine? Perhaps someone who seemed out of place?" Elise hesitated, her gaze drifting to the window, where the vineyard stretched toward the horizon. "I was distracted," she admitted. "Paul Garnier was handling the wine, as always. He's so particular about it, almost obsessive. Henry Dubois was lurking about, too, though he'd never admit it. And Mr. Leland, the investor, he was always hovering, talking about business at the worst times. But I didn't see anything specific. I wish I had." Miss Marple nodded, her mind cataloging the widow's words. Elise's composure was a shield, but there were chinks in it: the slight hesitation, the quick deflection of gossip, the absence of tears. She recalled a widow in St. Mary Mead, Mrs. Langley, who had mourned her husband with such perfect poise that the village suspected her of everything from poison to witchcraft. In the end, it was simply her nature, but Miss Marple knew that nature could hide as much as it revealed. They spoke a little longer, Miss Marple steering the conversation to lighter matters: the beauty of the chateau, the challenges of the harvest. Elise answered politely, but her responses were clipped, as though she longed to be alone. As Miss Marple rose to leave, she paused by a side table, where a photograph of Vincent and Elise stood in a silver frame. They were smiling, but his arm was around her shoulders, while hers rested stiffly at her side. "Such a handsome couple," Miss Marple said. "You must miss him terribly." Elise's lips tightened, and for a moment, her mask slipped, revealing a flicker of something: grief, perhaps, or guilt. "I do," she said softly, "more than anyone knows." As Miss Marple made her way back to the village, the mist had lifted, and the sun warmed the path. She thought of Elise's cool detachment, her careful words, and the whisper of a village girl who had seen her slipping away to meet Marcel Fournier under the cover of dusk. A wife neglected, Miss Marple mused, might turn to another for comfort, but would she turn to murder? The answer lay not in Elise's words but in her silences, and Miss Marple meant to listen closely. Back at the cottage, Mrs. Bantry was waiting, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Jane, how was she? Cold as ice, I bet. Did she confess to anything?" "Scandalous," she asked, pouring tea with a flourish. Miss Marple settled into her chair, her knitting resuming its steady rhythm. "Elise Moreau is a woman who guards her heart, Clara," she said. "She speaks of love, but her eyes tell a different story. There's something there, perhaps, not murder, but certainly a secret. We shall see what the village has to say." "About her late-night walks," Mrs. Bantry gasped, leaning forward. "An affair? Oh, Jane, this is getting better by the minute. Do you think she poisoned him to be free?" Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic. "It's too soon to say, Clara, but a woman's heart is like a locked room. Sometimes you must find the right key to see what's inside. I think a chat with the village gossips might be next." As the afternoon faded into evening, Miss Marple opened her notebook and added a few lines about Elise Moreau. Her composure was a puzzle, and her secret, whatever it was, might hold the key to Vincent's death. The pattern was still forming, but Miss Marple was patient. Truth, like a good wine, needed time to reveal its depth. Chapter 5. The sommelier's pride. The late morning sun filtered through the high, arched windows of Chateau Lyrac's cellar, casting a soft glow over rows of oak barrels and racks of dusty bottles. The air was cool and heavy with the scent of fermented grapes, a quiet sanctuary beneath the grandeur of the chateau above. Miss Jane Marple descended the stone steps with care, her hand resting lightly on the iron railing, her sensible shoes tapping softly against the worn treads. She had arranged to meet Paul Garnier, Vincent Moreau's sommelier, under the pretext of admiring the winery's collection. In truth, she sought to understand the man whose hands had poured the fatal glass, whose expertise made him both indispensable and suspect. Her knitting was tucked safely in her handbag, but her mind was as sharp as the needles she wielded, ready to unravel the threads of Paul's story. Paul Garnier stood at the far end of the cellar, polishing a set of crystal glasses. With a white cloth, his movements precise and almost reverent. He was a slight man, with a narrow face and meticulous grooming, his dark hair slicked back, his tie knotted with military precision. His eyes, when they met Miss Marple's, were guarded but polite, and he set the glass down with a care that suggested it was more than mere glassware to him. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice smooth but clipped, "this is an unexpected honor. Few visitors ask to see the cellar. Are you a connoisseur of wine?" Miss Marple smiled, her expression one of modest deference. "Oh, hardly, Monsieur Garnier," she said, her tone light. "In St. Mary Mead, we're more accustomed to tea than vintages, but I've always admired the craft of a fine winery. Chateau Lyrac's reputation is quite remarkable, and I understand you're the heart of it." Paul's lips twitched, a flicker of pride breaking through his reserve. "You're kind to say so," he replied, gesturing to the racks around them. "This cellar is my domain. Every bottle here is a story of soil, sun, and time." Vincent was the face of Chateau Lyrac, but I insured its soul. His voice held a note of quiet conviction, but Miss Marple caught the faint bitterness beneath. Like an off note in a symphony, she wandered to a rack, her fingers brushing the neck of a bottle, its label pristine despite the dust. "Such dedication," she said. "It must be a great responsibility, choosing the wines for occasions like the festival. That bottle of Chateau Lyrac the one poor Monsieur Moreau drank, was it one you selected?" Paul's hand paused mid-polish, and his eyes narrowed slightly. "It was," he said. "A 2018 reserve, one of our finest. I chose it myself, from this very cellar. It was perfect until it wasn't." His tone was defensive, and Miss Marple noted the way his fingers tightened on the cloth, as though steadying himself against her gentle probing. "Of course," she said, her voice soothing. "No one could have foreseen such a tragedy. I was at the festival, you know, and I saw how carefully you handled everything. You were pouring the wine, weren't you? It must be difficult, being so close to such an awful event." Paul set the cloth down, his movements deliberate. "It was my duty," he said. "Vincent insisted on the reserve for his toast. I brought the bottle from the cellar that morning, opened it myself, and poured it for him. I didn't taste it, why would I? It was his moment." He paused, then added, "The police have questioned me, naturally. They found nothing amiss in my actions." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes drifting to a shelf where bottles were arranged with almost obsessive precision, their labels perfectly aligned. "You take such pride in your work," she said. "It reminds me of a librarian in St. Mary Mead, Miss Hartnell, who kept every book in perfect order. She was quite put out when someone suggested her system was outdated. Pride can be such a delicate thing, can't it?" Paul's gaze sharpened, but he forced a smile. "Pride is what keeps this cellar alive," he said. "Vincent was brilliant with the public, but he didn't understand the nuances, the balance of a blend, the timing of a harvest. He'd take my advice, then ignore it for some grand gesture. It was frustrating, at times." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of innocent curiosity. "Frustrating enough to make one cross, I imagine. In my village, there was a gardener, Mr. Phipps, who grew splendid roses, but was overlooked for a prize because the judge preferred flashier blooms. He was ever so upset, though he didn't do anything drastic. But I wonder, Monsieur Garnier, did you ever feel overlooked?" Paul's smile faded, and he busied himself adjusting a bottle on the shelf. "I was valued here," he said, his voice tight. "Vincent knew my worth, even if he didn't always show it. I had no reason to harm him. My life is these wines, why would I ruin that?" Miss Marple nodded, her knitting needles clicking softly as she drew them from her bag, more for comfort than necessity. "Of course, she said. But it's curious, isn't it, how someone managed to tamper with that bottle? You were so careful, yet the poison found its way in. Did you notice anyone near the wine that day, perhaps someone who shouldn't have been? Paul hesitated, his eyes flicking to the cellar's entrance, as though expecting an interruption. I was busy, he said. The festival was chaotic. I saw Elise Moreau near the tent, but she was always flitting about, playing the hostess. Henry Dubois was skulking nearby, probably spying on Vincent's success. And that investor, Leland, was in and out, asking questions about the reserve. He's no vintner, he shouldn't have been near the bottles. Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes bright with interest. How interesting, she said. And where were you, Monsieur Garnier, just before the toast? I heard you were fetching something from the cellar. Paul's face stiffened, and he turned to polish another glass, though it was already spotless. I was, he said. Vincent wanted a second bottle, in case the crowd demanded more. I went to fetch it, but I was back in time to pour the toast. I told the police all this. Miss Marple smiled, her tone as gentle as ever. Of course, you've been most helpful. It's just that details can be so telling, don't you think? A man as meticulous as you must notice everything in this cellar. Paul's eyes met hers, and for a moment, she saw a flash of unease, quickly masked. I notice what matters, he said. The wines, the temperatures, the seals. If someone tampered with that bottle, it wasn't on my watch. They spoke. A little longer, Miss Marple, steering the conversation to the intricacies of winemaking, a subject Paul warmed to, despite his wariness. She learned of his years of training in Bordeaux, his dreams of opening his own winery, and his quiet resentment at being tethered to Vincent's shadow. As she took her leave, thanking him for his time, she paused at the cellar door. One last thing, she said, her voice almost apologetic. I saw a lovely decanter at the festival, the one you used for the toast. It was quite striking. Was it one you chose? Paul's hand froze on the doorframe. It was Vincent's favorite, he said. I used it because he asked. It's nothing special, just glass. But his voice was too quick, and Miss Marple noted the way his eyes avoided hers, as she climbed the steps back to the sunlight. The vineyards stretching before her like a green tapestry. Miss Marple's mind sifted through Paul's words. His pride was evident, a craftsman's devotion to his art. But so was his frustration, a slow-burning ember that might flare into something darker. His access to the wine was unmatched, and his absence during the critical moments before the toast was a gap in his story. Yet his fastidious nature suggested a man who planned carefully, not one who acted in haste. A murderer, she thought, might hide behind such precision. Back at Mrs. Bantry's cottage, the parlor was warm with the scent of fresh scones, and Clara was waiting, her eyes alight with anticipation. Jane, how was the sommelier? Did he confess? Oh, he must be the one handling the wine and all, she exclaimed, pouring tea with a flourish. Miss Marple settled into her chair, her knitting resuming its steady rhythm. Paul Garnier is a man who loves his work, Clara, she said, but he's also a man who feels unseen. His pride is his strength, and perhaps his weakness. Whether it led him to poison, I'm not certain, but there's something in his manner, hesitation, perhaps that bears watching. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her cup forgotten. You're teasing me, Jane. Do you think he slipped the cyanide in while he was pouring? Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic. It's possible, Clara, but poison requires more than opportunity. Requires intent. Paul Garnier had both, but so did others. I think a word with the festival staff might shed light on his movements that day. As the afternoon light softened, Miss Marple opened her notebook and added a few lines about Paul Garnier. His precision, his pride, his fleeting unease, they were pieces of a puzzle, and she was determined to see where they fit. The truth, she knew, lay in the details, and Paul's cellar held more than just wine. Chapter 6. The investor's ambition. The afternoon sun bathed St. Emilian's in a warm, golden light, softening the edges of the village's stone facades and casting long shadows across the cobbled streets. Miss Jane Marple, her straw hat tilted against the glare, made her way to the Rose and Crown, the village's only inn, where Charles Leland, the London investor, had taken up residence. The inn was a quaint, ivy-clad building, its signs swaying gently in the breeze, and its small dining room buzzed with the low hum of local chatter. Miss Marple's pretext for the visit was simple: a polite inquiry about the Vineyard's future, framed as the curiosity of a visitor charmed by St. Emilian's, but her true purpose was to study Leland, a man whose polished exterior and city manners set him apart in this rustic world, a man, she suspected, whose ambitions might have turned deadly. Inside, the dining room was a cozy affair, with dark beams overhead and tables adorned with checkered cloths. Charles Leland sat alone at a corner table, a glass of brandy before him, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the villager's simple attire. He was a man in his early 50s, with a lean face, sharp gray eyes, and a smile that seemed calculated to charm. As Miss Marple approached, he rose, his movements smooth and confident, and offered her a chair with a flourish that spoke of boardrooms rather than vineyards. "Miss Marple, I presume," he said, his voice carrying a trace of a London accent, polished but not ostentatious. "I've heard you're quite the observer of village life. Please, join me. Can I offer you a drink, tea, perhaps, or something stronger?" Miss Marple settled into the chair, her handbag resting on her lap, her smile as gentle as a summer breeze. "Tea would be lovely, Mr. Leland," she said. "I'm afraid I'm rather old-fashioned that way. I've come to express my sympathies about poor Monsieur Moreau. It must be a great shock, especially for someone so invested in Chateau Larac." Leland's smile tightened, though his eyes remained steady. "A tragedy," he agreed, signaling the innkeeper for tea. "Vincent was a remarkable man, if a bit stubborn. His loss is a blow to the Vineyard and to my interests, of course. But life and business must go on." He swirled his brandy, the liquid catching the light like amber dot. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of quiet sympathy. "It's such a splendid estate," she said. "I understand you've been helping it grow, though I suppose that comes with its challenges. In my village, St. Mary Mead, we had a gentleman who tried to modernize our little bakery. Not everyone took kindly to his ideas, though he meant well." Leland's laugh was low and controlled. "You're not wrong," he said. "Vincent and I had our differences. He was a traditionalist, you see, wedded to old methods, small batches, all that romantic nonsense. I saw Chateau Lyrac's potential to be a global brand, but he wouldn't hear of it. We argued, yes, but that's business, nothing personal." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her tone remained mild. "Oh, I'm sure. But it must be frustrating, investing so much and meeting resistance. I heard you made an offer to buy the vineyard outright. That's quite a bold move." Leland's hand paused on his glass, and for a moment his charm faltered, revealing a flicker of calculation. "You've been talking to the village gossips, haven't you?" he said, his smile returning, though it was thinner now. "Yes, I offered to buy Chateau Larac. Vincent was overextended, loans, expansions, all on shaky ground. I could have saved it, but he refused. Called it his legacy. A pity, really. Now it's Elise's burden, and she's no Vin—" Miss Marple tilted her head, her fingers brushing the handle of her teacup as the innkeeper set it before her. "How difficult for you," she said. "And to be at the festival when such a tragedy struck, it must have been dreadful. Were you nearby when Monsieur Moreau took his fatal sip?" Leland leaned back, his posture relaxed but his eyes watchful. "I was at the festival, yes, but not at the marquee when it happened. I had a meeting with a supplier in the village square business. Doesn't stop for toasts. I heard the commotion later, when Vincent collapsed. Shocking, of course, but I had no part in it. His voice was smooth, almost too smooth, and Miss Marple noted the way he glanced at his watch, as though eager to move on. Of course, she said, sipping her tea. It's just that a festival is such a busy place, with so many people coming and going. Someone must have been near that bottle of wine. Did you happen to see anyone, perhaps, Monsieur Garnier, or Madame Moreau, or even Monsieur Dubois acting unusually? Leland shrugged, his smile regaining its polish. I wasn't paying much attention to Vincent's tent. Garnier was fussing over the wine, as always man's obsessed with his bottles. Elise was playing the perfect hostess, though she seemed distracted. Dubois, well, he's always skulking about, isn't he? Envious sort. But I was focused on my own affairs. Nothing out of the ordinary. Miss Marple nodded, her knitting needles clicking softly as she drew them from her bag, more to occupy her hands than to work. You must be very busy, she said. I heard you were often at the winery, talking to the staff. It shows such dedication. In St. Mary Mead, we had a businessman, Mr. Carter, who took a great interest in our local shop. He was always about, asking questions, until it turned out he wanted to buy it out from under the owner. Not that you're like that, of course. Leland's eyes narrowed, though his smile held. Village life does breed suspicion, doesn't it? He said. I visited Chateau Lyrac to protect my investment, nothing more. Vincent's staff respected me, even if he didn't. But I assure you, Miss Marple, my interests are above board. Murder's bad for business, after all. Miss Marple's smile was serene, though her mind catalogued his every word. Quite so, she said. And yet someone thought murder was worth the risk. That bottle of Chateau Lyrac's, such a personal choice for poison. It makes one wonder who knew Vincent's habits so well. Leland sipped his brandy, his expression unreadable. You'd have to ask Garnier about that, he said. He handled the wine. Or perhaps at least she knew Vincent's every move. As for me, I'm just an investor, not a vintner. They spoke a little longer, Miss Marple steering the conversation to London and the challenges of rural investments, topics Leland warmed to with practiced ease. She learned of his company's financial ventures, his plans for expansion, and his frustration with Vincent's refusal to modernize. As she rose to leave, thanking him for the tea, she paused by the window, where the vineyards glowed in the fading light. Such a beautiful place, she said. It's no wonder someone might go to great lengths to claim it. Leland's smile was tight. Beauty's only worth what it earns, he said. Vincent didn't understand that. I hope Elise does. As Miss Marple stepped out into the village square, the evening air cool against her cheeks, she reflected on Leland's polished demeanor. His ambition was clear, a hunger that gleamed beneath his charm like a blade under silk. His alibi was vague, his presence at the winery frequent, and his motive control of Chateau Little. Yet his confidence suggested a man who believed himself untouchable. In St. Mary Mead, she had known men like him, men who thought their plans too clever to be seen. But Miss Marple saw, and she remembered. Back at Mrs. Bantry's cottage, the parlor was aglow with lamplight, and Clara was waiting, her eyes wide with anticipation. Jane, was he dreadful? A cold-blooded tycoon, I bet. Did he confess? She asked, pouring tea with her usual enthusiasm. Miss Marple settled into her chair, her knitting resuming its gentle rhythm. Charles Leland is a man who wants Clara, she said. He wanted Chateau Lyrac, and Vincent stood in his way. His words are smooth, but his eyes are sharp. Whether he poured the poison, I'm not sure, but he's a man who plans, and plans carefully. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her cup forgotten. Oh, Jane, you think he's the one, don't you? All that money and ambition, it's so sinister. Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic. Ambition is a powerful motive, Clara, but so are envy and betrayal. Leland's story has gaps, and I think the festival holds the answers. A word with the villagers who saw him that day might tell us more. As the evening deepened, Miss Marple opened her notebook and added a few lines about Charles Leland. His charm was a mask, his ambition a fire, and his vague alibi a shadow in the pattern she was weaving. The truth, she knew, was close, hidden, in the spaces between what people said and what they did not. Chapter 7. The festivals, shadows. The village of St. Emilian's wore a subdued air as the sun climbed toward noon, its golden light failing to dispel the lingering unease from Vincent Moreau's death. The festival square, so recently alive with music and laughter, now stood quiet, its cobbled expanse dotted with only a few villagers sweeping away the last traces of the celebration. The crimson marquee of Chateau Lorec had been dismantled, leaving a bare patch of ground where Vincent had fallen, a silent testament to the tragedy. Miss Jane Marple, her straw hat tilted against the glare, walked slowly through the square, her eyes scanning the scene with the quiet intensity of a woman who saw stories in every detail. Her purpose was to retrace the festival's final moments, to gather the scattered threads of observation from those who had been present. In her handbag, alongside her knitting, she carried a small notebook, its pages filling with the fragments of a puzzle only she could see. Miss Marple's first stop was the cafe at the square's edge, where tables spilled onto the pavement and the scent of fresh bread mingled with coffee. The owner, Madame Lefevre, a stout woman with a sharp tongue and sharper memory, was wiping down a counter when Miss Marple approached. "Good morning, Madame," Miss Marple said, her voice warm and unassuming. "I wonder if I might trouble you for a cup of tea." And perhaps a moment of your time. I was at the festival when poor Monsieur Moreau passed, and it's weighed on my mind. Madame Lefevre's eyes lit with the gleam of a born gossip. "A terrible thing," she said, setting a teapot before Miss Marple. "Vincent was the heart of this village, for all his showiness. Poison, they say, in his own wine. Sit, sit. I'll tell you what I saw." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I was serving drinks all day, but I kept an eye on that Chateau Lorec tent. Paul Garnier was there, fussing over the bottles like they were his children. He poured that wine himself, you know, for Vincent's toast." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of gentle curiosity. "How diligent he must be," she said. "Did you notice anything unusual about him more? Anyone else near the tent?" Madame Lefevre pursed her lips. "Well, now you mention it. Elise Moreau was there, looking like a queen in that silk dress, but she slipped away just before Vincent drank. Pale as a ghost, she was, and not a tear when he fell. And Henry Dubois, he was skulking about, pretending to tend his own stall. But I saw him watching Vincent's tent, his face like thunder. As for that city man, Leland, he was in and out all day, talking to the winery staff. Too smooth, that one, if you ask me." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly as she drew them from her bag, her hands moving with practiced ease. "How observant you are," she said. "It's like my village, St. Mary Mead, where everyone sees something, even if they don't know it's important. Did you see anyone near the wine itself? Perhaps handling the bottle?" Madame Lefevre frowned, her hands pausing on the counter. "Not the bottle, no, but I saw Leland near the tent, just before the toast, adjusting something in his pocket. Could have been nothing, a handkerchief, maybe, but it struck me odd. He's not the sort to get his hands dirty, you know." Thanking her, Miss Marple sipped her tea and moved on, her steps taking her to a flower stall where a young woman, Jean, was arranging roses. Jean, barely 20, had the wide-eyed eagerness of youth and a tendency to chatter. "Oh, mademoiselle," she said, When Miss Marple inquired about the festival, it was awful. I was selling flowers near the marquee, and I saw Madame Moreau leave, just as Vincent raised his glass. She looked not sad, exactly, but nervous, like she wanted to be anywhere else. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "How interesting," she said. "And the others, did you see Monsieur Garnier? Or perhaps Monsieur Dubois?" Jean nodded, her fingers twisting a rose stem. Monsieur Garnier was so busy, checking every glass, every bottle. He's always like that, though Fousey. Monsieur Dubois was at his stall, but I saw him walk past Vincent's tent more than once, glaring. He didn't stop, but he didn't need to, did he? Everyone knew he hated Vincent. Miss Marple smiled, slipping Jean a coin for a small bouquet. "You're very perceptive," she said. "And Mr. Leland, the investor. Did he catch your eye?" Jean hesitated, then lowered her voice. "He was there, talking to one of Vincent's workers. I didn't hear what they said, but he looked sneaky, like he was up to something. He kept touching his coat pocket, like he was checking it was still there." Miss Marple's next stop was a bakery across the square, where Monsieur a portly man with flour-dusted hands, was stacking loaves. He was less forthcoming than Madame Lefevre, but his gruff demeanor softened under Miss Marple's gentle questions. "I saw what everyone saw," he said. "Vincent showing off, as usual. Garnier poured the wine, Elise flitted about, and Dubois was sulking. That Leland fellow, though he was near the tent, talking to a delivery boy, looked like he was giving him something, but I couldn't see what." As Miss Marple wandered the square, she spoke to others, a fruit vendor, who recalled Elise's distracted air, a fiddler who had seen Henry linger near Vincent's stall, and a delivery boy, young Pierre, who blushed when questioned about Leland. "He gave me a tip to fetch a crate from the winery tent," Pierre admitted. "But I saw him put something in his pocket, a small bottle, maybe. I thought it was medicine." Each conversation added a thread to Miss Marple's tapestry, her mind weaving a picture of the festival's final moments. The witnesses painted a scene of subtle tensions: Paul's meticulous care with the wine, Elise's timely absence, Henry's brooding presence, and Leland's mysterious vial. Yet none had seen the act of poisoning, and the bottle's journey from cellar to glass remained a shadow in the narrative. As she returned to Mrs. Bantry's cottage, the sun was dipping low, casting the village in a soft amber glow. Clara was waiting in the parlor, her eyes bright with anticipation. "Jane, you've been out all day. Did you find the murderer?" "Oh, it's too exciting," she exclaimed, pouring tea with a clatter. Miss Marple settled into her chair, her knitting resuming its steady rhythm. "The festival was a stage, Clara," she said, "and each player had their part. Paul poured the wine, Elise slipped away, Henry watched with envy, and Leland carried something in his pocket. The truth is there, in what they did and didn't do." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her cup forgotten. "A bottle, you say? Oh, Jane, that must be the poison. Leland's the one, isn't he?" Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic. "It's possible, Clara, but appearances can deceive. A small bottle might hold perfume, or medicine, or something more sinister. We need more than shadows to be certain. I think a visit to the winery cellar might shed light on how that poison reached the wine." As dusk settled over St. Emilian's, Miss Marple opened her notebook and added her observations. The festival's shadows held secrets, and each suspect's movements formed a pattern she was beginning to discern. The truth, she knew, was like a vine hidden beneath the surface, waiting for patient hands to uncover it. Chapter 8. The cellar's clothed. Morning air in St. Emilian's carried a crisp edge, a reminder that summer was yielding to the first whispers of autumn. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in her familiar shawl, stood at the entrance to Chateau Lyrac's cellar, her straw hat tilted slightly to shield her eyes from the sun's low angle. Inspector Craddock had granted her permission to visit the cellar. a concession made with a mix of respect and curiosity, for he knew her knack for uncovering truths in the smallest details. The heavy oak door creaked as a winery worker, a young man named Claude, led her down the stone steps into the cool, shadowed depths. Miss Marple's purpose was clear: to examine the place where Vincent Moreau's fatal bottle had been stored, to find the trace of malice that had turned celebration into tragedy. Her handbag, slung over her arm, held her knitting and notebook, but it was her sharp eyes that were her true tools today. The cellar stretched before her, a cavern of quiet order, its stone walls lined with racks of bottles, their dark glass glinting faintly in the light of hanging lanterns. Barrels stood in neat rows, their wood stained with age, and the air was thick with the earthy scent of oak and wine. Claude, a nervous youth with ink-stained fingers, hovered nearby, clearly unused to visitors in this sanctum. "This is where we keep the reserve vintages," he said, gesturing to a rack near the far wall. "Monsieur Garnier is very particular about it. That's where the festival bottle came from, the 2018 Chateau Le rack." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of polite interest as she stepped closer, her shoes tapping softly on the stone floor. "Such a splendid collection," she said, her voice warm but probing. "It must be quite a responsibility, guarding these treasures. Was it you who fetched the bottle for Monsieur Garnier that day?" Claude shook his head, his hands twisting. "Together, no, mademoiselle. Monsieur Garnier chose it himself. He always does for important events. I was in the vineyard, helping with the harvest, until the festival started. I only heard about Monsieur Moreau later." Miss Marple's eyes scanned the rack, noting the meticulous arrangement of the bottles. Their labels aligned with a precision that spoke of Paul Garnier's fastidious hand. She paused, her gaze catching on a single bottle, slightly askew, its neck bearing a faint smudge of white powder, barely visible against the dark glass. "How curious," she murmured, leaning closer, but not touching. "This bottle seems a bit out of place. Do you clean the racks often, Claude?" The young man flushed, his eyes darting to the bottle. "Every week, mademoiselle, but Monsieur Garnier inspects everything himself. He'd notice anything amiss. That powder, it shouldn't be there." His voice held a note of unease, and Miss Marple filed it away, her mind already turning over possibilities. She wandered further, her fingers brushing the edge of a barrel as she asked, "And who else comes down here? Madame Moreau, perhaps, or Monsieur Dubois, or that gentleman from London, Mr. Leland?" Claude hesitated, his brow furrowing. "Madame Moreau sometimes comes to check the inventory, but not often. Monsieur Dubois has no business here, he's a rival, you know. As for Monsieur Leland, he's been down a few times, asking about the reserve stock. He said it was for his investment, but Monsieur Garnier didn't like him poking about. Said he wasn't a true vintner." Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. "How interesting," she said. "In my village, St. Mary Mead, we had a grocer who was very particular about his stockroom. When someone tampered with his jars, it caused quite a stir. It's amazing what one can learn from a place like this, don't you think?" Claude nodded, though his eyes remained wary. "I suppose so. But this cellar's locked most of the time. Only Monsieur Garnier and a few of us have keys. If someone got to that bottle, they'd have needed access." Miss Marple thanked him, her tone as gentle as ever, and asked to be left alone for a moment to admire the craftsmanship. Claude hesitated, then retreated up the stairs, leaving her in the cellar's quiet embrace. She returned to the rack, her eyes fixed on the powdered bottle. It was a small thing, easily overlooked, but to Miss Marple it was a shout in the silence. She drew a handkerchief from her handbag, and, careful not to disturb the evidence, noted the bottle's position third from the left, second shelf from the top. She would inform Craddock immediately. When Inspector Craddock arrived, summoned by a discreet note, he brought a constable and a small evidence kit. Miss Marple pointed out the bottle, and Craddock's team carefully bagged it for testing. "You've a sharp eye, Miss Marple," he said, his voice tinged with admiration. "If this is cyanide, it's a breakthrough. The bottle's from the same batch as the festival wine. Someone got to it here, in the cellar." Miss Marple nodded, her knitting needles clicking softly as she drew them from her bag, more for comfort than necessity. "It's the intimacy of it, Inspector," she said. "Whoever did this knew the cellar, knew Vincent's habits, knew which bottle would be chosen. That narrows our field, doesn't it?" Craddock frowned, his notebook open. "It points to Garnier, for one. He's in charge here, has the keys, chose the bottle. But Elise has access to the house, and Leland's been seen down here. Even Dubois might have slipped in, though it's less likely. What's your take?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her tone remained mild. "It's the why that matters, Inspector. Paul's pride is in these wines wood. He poisoned his own work. Elise might have motives, but would she? Risk the estate she inherit? Leland's ambition is clear, but he's no vintner. How would he know which bottle to tamper with? And Henry, well, his envy is strong, but this feels too subtle for his blunt nature. We need to know who was here, and when." Craddock nodded, jotting notes. "We'll test the powder and check the cellar's lock records. The staff keep a log of who comes and goes, though it's not foolproof. Anything else you noticed?" Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the rack, where the bottles stood like silent sentinels. "Only this, Inspector," she said. "The powder was on the neck, not the base. Whoever handled that bottle did so with care, perhaps wearing gloves, but they left a trace. People are so careless, even when they think they're clever." As she climbed the steps back to the daylight, the vineyards stretching before her like a green quilt, Miss Marple's mind sifted through the cellar's secrets. The powder was a clue, but it was the access that intrigued her. Paul's domain was the cellar, yet Leland's visits and Elise's presence suggested others could have slipped in. Henry's exclusion made him less likely, but not impossible. The log, she thought, might hold the key. Back at Mrs. Bantry's cottage, the parlor was warm with the scent of lavender and tea. Clara was waiting, her eyes bright with anticipation. "Jane, a clue in the cellar. Oh, you're brilliant. Was it the poison? Who do you think did it?" she exclaimed, nearly spilling her tea in her excitement. Miss Marple settled into her chair, her knitting resuming its gentle rhythm. "A trace of powder, Clara, on a bottle that shouldn't have it," she said. "It's a small thing, but small things tell stories. Someone entered that cellar with intent, and they left their mark. Whether it was Paul, Elise, or Leland, we'll know more when the tests come back." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her cup forgotten. "Leland, I bet. That sneaky bottle in his pocket too. Said so yourself. He's the one, isn't he?" Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic. "Perhaps, Clara, but a clue is not a conclusion. The cellar is a locked room, and only a few hold the key. I think a look at that log, and perhaps a word with the winery staff, might show us who opened the door." As the afternoon faded, Miss Marple opened her notebook and added a few lines about the cellar's clue. The powder was a whisper of guilt, but it was the hands that left it careful, calculated hands that would lead her to the truth. The pattern was clearer now, and she was patient enough to follow its threads. Chapter 9. The motive unraveled. The late afternoon light filtered through the lace curtains of Mrs. Bantry's rented cottage, casting delicate patterns across the parlor's polished floor. Miss Jane Marple sat in her usual armchair, a cup of tea cooling beside her, her knitting needles moving with their familiar, soothing rhythm. The discovery of the cyanide-laced bottle in Chateau Lyrac's cellar had sharpened her focus, and she was now sifting through the motives that swirled around. Vincent Moreau's death like leaves in a September breeze. Mrs. Bantry, perched on the edge of the sofa, was brimming with questions, her eyes wide with the thrill of the unfolding mystery. "Jane, you must tell me everything," she insisted, her voice a mix of excitement and impatience. "That powder in the cellar, cyanide, wasn't it? Who do you think did it? Oh, it's all so dreadful." Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile, though her eyes remained thoughtful, fixed on some invisible point beyond the room. "It's the why that matters, Clara," she said softly. "The how is clear enough. Now the cyanide was added to the bottle in the cellar, likely before it was sealed for the festival. But the why tells us who, and that's where the pattern lies. Each of our suspects had a reason to wish Vincent gone, but only one had a motive strong enough to act and the means to do it so precisely." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her cup forgotten. "Go on, Jane. You've got that look you're onto something, aren't you?" Miss Marple's needles paused, and she folded her hands in her lap. "Let's consider them, Clara, one by one. Henry Dubois, with his struggling vineyard, envied Vincent's success. His bitterness was plain when I spoke to him, but poison is a subtle weapon, and Henry strikes me as a man of blunt passions. Would he have the patience to slip into the cellar undetected? I wonder." Mrs. Bantry nodded eagerly. "He's too angry for something so sneaky, don't you think? What about Elise? A scorned wife, maybe, with that artist fellow in the background." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Elise Moreau is a puzzle, Clara. Her composure is like a locked door, but there's something behind it, perhaps loneliness, perhaps resentment. She stands to inherit Chateau Lyrac, but she has no love for running it. Would she poison Vincent to be free, only to be saddled with an estate she doesn't want? And yet, her access to the house and cellar makes her a possibility. Her absence at the moment of the toast. It's curious, don't you think?" Mrs. Bantry gasped. "Oh, Jane, you're right. She slipped away. Jean at the flower stall said so. Maybe she knew what was coming." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression serene but probing. "Perhaps. But let's not forget Paul Garnier. His pride in his work is fierce, and he felt overlooked by Vincent. The cellar is his domain. He chose the bottle, poured the wine. If anyone could tamper with it unnoticed, it's him. But to poison a vintage he cherished, it seems almost a betrayal of himself. Still, pride can twist a man's heart in strange ways." Mrs. Bantry clapped her hands. "He's too fussy to ruin his own wine, surely. So that leaves Leland, that city man, with his big plans. He's the one, isn't he? All that talk about buying the vineyard." Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic. "Charles Leland is a man driven by ambition, Clara. He wanted Chateau Lyrac, and Vincent's refusal must have stung. I learned from Inspector Craddock this morning that Leland's company is in financial trouble, debts piling up. Investors restless. Acquiring Chateau Lyrac would have been his salvation, a jewel to restore his reputation, and that small bottle young Pierre saw him with at the festival. It's troubling, isn't it?" Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. "A bottle of poison. Oh, Jane, you've got him. He sneaked into the cellar and did it." Miss Marple raised a hand, her tone gentle but firm. "Not so fast, Clara. A motive is not proof, and Leland is too clever to leave such an obvious trail. But his frequent visits to the winery, his vague alibi, and that vial in his pocket, they weave a thread we can't ignore. The cellar log, which Craddock is checking, may tell us more. Someone entered that cellar, and they left that powder behind." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Inspector Craddock entered, his face grim but alert, his notebook tucked under his arm. "Miss Marple," he said, nodding to Mrs. Bantry, "the tests are back. The powder on the bottle is cyanide, no question. It was applied to the neck, likely when the bottle was sealed. The cellar log shows entries for Garnier, as expected, and Elise, who checked inventory days before the festival. Leland was logged in once, a week prior, under investor inspection. No record of Dubois, but the log's not airtight. Staff come and go. Miss Marple nodded, her knitting resuming its rhythm. Thank you, Inspector. That narrows our field, doesn't it? Only someone familiar with the cellar could have known which bottle would be chosen for Vincent's toast. Paul of course knew. Elise might have, as she managed the household. Leland, with his visits, could have learned the winery's habits. Henry, though, would have needed an accomplice or extraordinary luck. Craddock rubbed his chin. Garnier, the obvious one, but he's adamant he'd never harmed the wine. Elise's motive is murky. She gains the estate, but it's a burden. Leland's got the strongest reason, with his company's troubles. I'm checking his alibi further. Meeting at the festival is shaky. No one can confirm it fully. Miss Marple's eyes brightened. It's the vineyard itself, Inspector, she said. Someone wanted it, or what it represents: success, control, freedom. Leland's ambition points there, but we must be sure. People are so predictable. When you understand their desires, but they're also clever at hiding them. Mrs. Bantry, unable to contain herself, clapped her hands again. Jane, you're going to catch him, aren't you? Oh, I can't wait to see his face when you do, Miss. Marple's smile was gentle but resolute. We need more than suspicion, Clara. A trap, perhaps, to see who flinches. Inspector, might you gather the suspects at the winery? A small announcement, say, new evidence about the bottle might stir something revealing. Craddock's eyes lit with understanding. A good idea, Miss Marple. I'll arrange it for tomorrow. If one of them knows more than they're letting on, we'll see it in their eyes. As Craddock left, Miss Marple opened her notebook, her pen moving with careful precision. She wrote of Leland's ambition, Elise's detachment, Paul's pride, and Henry's envy, each a thread in the pattern she was weaving. The cyanide in the cellar was a fact, but the hand that placed it was still a shadow. Leland's motive burned brightest, but Miss Marple knew better than to trust the obvious. In St. Mary Mead, she had seen motives twist and turn, and she would not rush to judgment here. Mrs. Bantry, watching her friend, sighed dramatically. Jane, you're too calm about it all. I'd be pacing the floor, certain it's Leland. What's next? Miss Marple closed her notebook, her eyes drifting to the window where the vineyards glowed in the fading light. We wait, Clara, she said, and we watch. The truth is like a vine, it grows in its own time, but it always surfaces. Chapter 10. The Trap. The early evening light cast a soft glow over Chateau Lyrac, its pale stone walls catching the last rays of the sun as the vineyards stretched into the distance. There rose a silent testament to Vincent Moreau's legacy. Miss Jane Marple stood at the edge of the winery's tasting room, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, her straw hat resting on a side table. The room, with its polished oak table and shelves of gleaming bottles, had been chosen for Inspector Craddock's gathering, a carefully staged meeting to unsettle the suspects and perhaps coax the truth into the open. Miss Marple's suggestion of a trap had been simple: announce new evidence about the poisoned bottle, and watch for a reaction that betrayed guilt. Her knitting was tucked in her handbag, but her eyes were as sharp as ever, scanning the room with the quiet alertness of a woman who saw the world's secrets in its smallest gestures. Inspector Craddock stood at the head of the table, his notebook open, his demeanor brisk but calm. The suspects had arrived one by one, each with a mix of curiosity and unease. Elise Moreau sat nearest the window, her black dress impeccable, her face a mask of composed detachment, though her fingers toyed with a pearl bracelet. Paul Garnier stood by a shelf of wines, his posture rigid, his eyes darting to the bottles as if seeking refuge in their familiarity. Henry Dubois slouched in a chair, his weathered hands clasped tightly, his scowl deepening with every passing minute. Charles Leland, polished as ever in a tailored suit, leaned against the wall, his smile confident but his gaze watchful. Mrs. Bantry, invited as a witness at Miss Marple's insistence, sat beside her friend, her eyes wide with barely contained excitement. Craddock cleared his throat, drawing the room's attention. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice steady. "We've made a significant discovery in the investigation into Vincent Moreau's death. New evidence has come to light about the bottle of Chateau Lyrac served at the festival, the bottle that contained the cyanide. We believe we're close to identifying how it was tampered with, and by whom." A ripple of tension passed through the room. Elise's bracelet stilled, her eyes fixed on Craddock with a flicker of alarm. Paul's hand tightened on a bottle, his knuckles whitening. Henry's scowl deepened, but he said nothing, his gaze shifting to the floor. Leland's smile remained, though his fingers brushed his cufflinks, a gesture Miss Marple noted as deliberate, almost rehearsed. She leaned forward slightly, her voice gentle but clear. "It's such a dreadful business," she said, addressing the group. "In my village, St. Mary Mead, we once had a case where a jar of preserves was tampered with, such a small thing, but it told us everything. The cellar here, I understand, is where the bottle was kept. Someone must have known exactly which one Vincent would choose for his toast." Paul's head snapped up, his voice sharp. "I chose the bottle," he said. "The 2018 Reserve. It was perfect for the occasion. I checked it myself, as I always do. If there was cyanide, it wasn't my doing." His tone was defensive, but Miss Marple caught the faint tremor in his voice, a crack in his fastidious armor. Elise spoke next, her voice cool but measured. "I rarely went to the cellar," she said. "Vincent left that to Paul. I was busy with the household and the festival preparations. I had no reason to touch the wine." Her eyes met Miss Marple's, steady but guarded, as though challenging her to probe further. Henry snorted, his arms crossing. "This is a waste of time," he said. "I wasn't anywhere near that cellar. Vincent and I weren't friends, but I'd never stoop to poison. That's a coward's way, not mine." His bluntness was convincing, but Miss Marple noted the way his eyes flicked to Leland, a spark of suspicion in their depths. Leland's laugh was light, almost dismissive. "Really, Inspector, this is quite theatrical," he said, his tone smooth. "I'm an investor, not a chemist. I was in a meeting during the toast. Ask my supplier, he'll confirm it. As for the cellar, I visited once or twice, but only to assess the stock. If there's cyanide, it's likely a worker's mistake, some chemical left carelessly on a bottle." His smile was unwavering, but Miss Marple saw the slight tightening of his jaw, a telltale sign of strain. Craddock flipped a page in his notebook, his eyes narrowing. "The powder on the bottle was no mistake," he said. "It was cyanide, applied to the neck, likely when the bottle was sealed. Only someone with access to the cellar could have done it, and we've confirmed the log. Paul, Elise, and Mr. Leland were there in the days before the festival. Monsieur Dubois, you're not recorded, but we know logs can be bypassed." Henry's face reddened. "I told you, I wasn't there," he snapped. "Ask anyone. I was at my own vineyard, working." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly as she drew them from her bag, her hands moving with calm precision. "It's so curious, isn't it?" she said, her voice mild but piercing. "The festival was such a public stage, yet the poison was so private. Whoever did this knew Vincent's habits, his love for that 2018 Reserve, his grand toasts. And Mr. Leland, I believe you were seen near the winery tent, adjusting something in your pocket. A small bottle, perhaps." Leland's smile faltered, though he recovered quickly. "A misunderstanding," he said. "I carry a flask sometimes, brandy, not poison. I was nowhere near the wine itself." "You're grasping at straws, Miss Marple." His tone was polite, but there was a hardness beneath it, and Miss Marple noted the way his fingers brushed his cufflinks again. A nervous tick. Elise's bracelet clicked against the table, a sharp sound in the quiet room. "This is absurd," she said, her voice rising slightly. "I loved Vincent. I wouldn't harm him, no matter what the village gossips say. If you're looking for someone with a grudge, look at Henry or Paul, who is always complaining about Vincent's decisions." Paul's face flushed, and he stepped forward, his voice tight. "I respected Vincent, even if we disagreed," he said. "I'd never ruin a vintage, let alone a life. The cellar was locked. Someone must have stolen a key or bribed a worker." Craddock raised a hand, his voice firm. "We're checking every possibility," he said. "But one of you knows more than you're saying. The delivery boy, Pierre, saw something, a small bottle, Mr. Leland, in your possession, and we're tracing its contents now." Leland's composure cracked, his smile vanishing. "That boy's mistaken," he said, his voice sharp. "I gave him a tip, nothing more. You've no proof, Inspector." But his eyes darted to the door, and Miss Marple saw it, a flicker of fear. Quickly masked. The room fell silent, the tension thick as the suspects exchanged glances. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her eyes moving from one face to another. Paul's defensiveness, Elise's cool deflection, Henry's blunt anger, Leland's faltering charm. Each was a piece of the puzzle, and the trap was tightening. Back at the cottage, Mrs. Bantry was practically bouncing with excitement. "Jane, you saw it, didn't you? Leland's face, he's guilty. That bottle in his pocket, it's the cyanide, I know it," she exclaimed, pouring tea with a clatter. Miss Marple settled into her chair, her knitting resuming its rhythm. "Leland is nervous, Clara," she said. "But nervousness isn't guilt. His ambition is clear, and his alibi is weak, but we need more. The others, too, have their secrets. Tomorrow, we'll see what Craddock's tests reveal about that vial." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. "You're going to catch him, Jane. I can feel it." Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic. "We're close, Clara," she said. "The truth is like a cork in a bottle that pops when you least expect it. We must simply keep pressing." As night fell over St. Emilian's, Miss Marple opened her notebook and added a few lines about the trap. Leland's reaction had been telling, but the others' responses held clues too. The pattern was nearly complete, and she was ready for the final twist. Chapter 11. The confession. The morning sun rose over St. Emilian's with a gentle warmth, bathing the village in a soft light that belied the tension simmering beneath its tranquil surface. Chateau Lyrac's tasting room, where the suspects had gathered the previous evening, stood quiet now, its oak table cleared of glasses, and its shelves of bottles glinting in the early light. Miss Jane Marple sat in Mrs. Bantry's parlor, her knitting needles clicking with their usual steady rhythm, though her mind was far from the scarf taking shape in her hands. The trap set with Inspector Craddock had stirred the waters, and Charles Leland's faltering composure had cast a shadow of suspicion. Yet Miss Marple knew that suspicion alone was not enough. The truth required a final nudge, a moment where guilt could no longer hide behind charm or deflection. Today, she sensed, that moment was near. Inspector Craddock arrived at the cottage shortly after breakfast, his face taut with purpose. He carried a slim folder, its contents the results of the tests on the vial seen in Leland's possession. Mrs. Bantry, bustling about with a tray of tea and biscuits, could barely contain her excitement. "Jane, he's here. Oh, this must be IFA-proof. Tell us, Inspector, is it Leland?" she exclaimed, nearly dropping a saucer in her haste. Craddock raised a hand, his voice calm but firm. "We've made progress, Mrs. Bantry," he said, nodding to Miss Marple. "The vial young Pierre saw Leland with at the festival, it's been traced. A chemist in the next town confirmed selling a small bottle of cyanide to a man matching Leland's description, under the guise of industrial use. Pierre's testimony places it in Leland's pocket just before the toast. It's damning, but we need a confession to seal it. He's a slippery one. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained serene. People are so careless. Inspector, she said, setting her knitting aside. They think their plans are clever, but they always leave a trace. Mr. Leland's ambition was his strength, but it's also his weakness. Shall we pay him a visit? A man cornered often speaks more than he intends. Craddock agreed, and they arranged to confront Leland at the Rose and Crown, where he was still staying. Miss Marple, her shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, walked beside Craddock, through the village square, her steps slow but purposeful. The inn's dining room was quiet, save for a few early patrons sipping coffee. Leland sat at his usual corner table, a newspaper spread before him, though his eyes were fixed on the window, as if expecting trouble. When he saw Craddock and Miss Marple, his smile was tight, his fingers brushing his cufflinks in that familiar nervous gesture. "Inspector, Miss Marple," he said, rising with a forced ease. "To what do I owe this visit? More questions about poor Vincent, I presume." His voice was smooth, but Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in his hand as he folded the newspaper. Craddock wasted no time. "Mr. Leland, we've evidence tying you to the cyanide used in Vincent Moreau's murder," he said, his tone clipped. "A chemist identified you as the buyer of a vial matching the one seen in your possession at the festival. Young Pierre saw you with it near the winery tent, moments before the toast. Care to explain?" Leland's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing. "This is preposterous," he said, his voice rising slightly. "A boy's word and a chemist's guess. I bought no such thing. I told you, I carry a flask of brandy, nothing more. You're fishing, Inspector, and you've caught nothing." Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice gentle but piercing. "It's curious, Mr. Leland," she said, "how small things betray us. In my village, St. Mary Mead, we had a gentleman who thought himself very clever, hiding his misdeeds behind a charming smile. But the truth always surfaces. You were seen in the cellar. You knew Vincent's habits, and that vial. It wasn't brandy, was it? You wanted Chateau Lyrac, and Vincent stood in your way." Leland's face paled, though he forced a laugh. "You're a fanciful old lady, Miss Marple," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I wanted the Vineyard, yes, but I'm no murderer. Vincent's death hurts my plans. Why would I risk that?" Craddock opened his folder, revealing a photograph of the vial and the chemist's statement. "This is no fancy," he said. "The cyanide on the bottle in the cellar matches the type you purchased. Pierre's testimony places you at the tent, and the cellar log confirms your visit. You had motive, means, and opportunity. Deny it if you like, but the evidence is clear." Leland's composure cracked, his hands clenching into fists. "You've no proof. I touched that bottle," he snapped. "Anyone could have bought cyanide, Garnier, Elise, even Dubois. Why pin it on me?" Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her gaze held him fast. "Because, Mr. Leland, you're a man who plans," she said. "You knew Vincent's toast would be the 2018 reserve. Paul mentioned it in your presence, didn't he? You visited the cellar, learned its routines, and saw your chance. A small bottle, a quick moment when no one was looking. It was clever, but not clever enough. The powder on the bottle's neck, the vial in your pocket, they tell a story. You can't escape." Leland's shoulders slumped, and for a moment, silence hung heavy in the room. Then, with a bitter laugh, he sank back into his chair. "He was ruining everything," he muttered, his voice low. "Chateau Lyrac could have been a fortune. But Vincent clung to his precious traditions. My company was sinking debts, investors breathing down my neck. I offered to buy him out, but he laughed at me. Laughed, I thought. One sip, and the vineyard would be mine. Elise would sell. She doesn't care about it. It was so simple. He buried his face in his hands, his charm gone, leaving only a man undone by his own ambition. Craddock signaled to a constable waiting outside, who stepped forward with handcuffs. "Charles Leland, you're under arrest for the murder of Vincent Moreau," he said, his voice firm. As the cuffs clicked into place, Leland looked up, his eyes hollow. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he said, almost to himself. "It was just business." Miss Marple watched as Leland was led away, her expression one of quiet sorrow. "Ambition is a dangerous thing, Inspector," she said. "It blinds people to the cost of their desires. In St. Mary Mead, we had a man who wanted a promotion. So badly he spread lies about his rival. No murder, thankfully, but the heart of it was the same. Back at the cottage, Mrs. Bantry was beside herself with excitement. "Jane, you did it. You caught him. Oh, I knew it was Leland. That sneaky bottle, that smarmy smile," she exclaimed, pouring tea with a clatter that threatened to topple the pot. Miss Marple settled into her chair, her knitting resuming its gentle rhythm. "It was the pattern, Clara," she said. "Leland's ambition was too bright, his plans too careful. The vial, the cellar, his weak alibi, they all pointed to him. But it's a sad business when a man's dreams lead to such ruin." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. "You're a marvel, Jane. What now? Will you stay for the trial?" Miss Marple's smile was enigmatic. "I think, Clara, a quiet return to St. Mary Mead is in order. The truth is out, and St. Emilian's can heal. But I'll keep my notebook, just in case." As the evening settled over the village, Miss Marple opened her notebook and added a final entry about Charles Leland. His confession had closed the case, but the lesson lingered. Ambition, unchecked, could poison more than wine. The pattern was complete, and she closed the book with a sigh of quiet satisfaction. Chapter 12. The village restored the golden light of late afternoon bathed St. Emilian's, softening the edges of its stone cottages and casting long shadows across the vineyards that rolled gently toward the horizon. The village, so recently shaken by Vincent Moreau's murder, seemed to breathe a little easier now, as though the air itself had been cleansed by the truth. Miss Jane Marple sat in the parlor of Mrs. Bantry's rented cottage, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm, a half-finished scarf spilling across her lap. Her straw hat rested on a side table, and her small notebook, its pages filled with the careful observations that had unraveled the case, lay closed beside her teacup. The arrest of Charles Leland had restored a fragile calm to the village, and Miss Marple, ever watchful, was preparing to return to St. Mary Mead. Her holiday now complete, Mrs. Bantry bustled in, her floral dress a burst of color against the parlor's muted tones, her face alight with the satisfaction of a mystery solved. "Jane, you're a wonder," she exclaimed, setting down a tray of scones and jam with a flourish. "To think it was Leland all along, that smooth-talking city man, poisoning poor Vincent for a vineyard. Oh, I shall tell everyone in St. Mary Mead how you caught him. Now, tell me, how did you know it was him?" Miss Marple's lips curved into a gentle smile, her eyes twinkling with quiet amusement. "It was human nature, Clara," she said, her voice soft but clear. "People are so very much alike, you know. Whether in St. Emilian's or St. Mary Mead, Leland's ambition was too fierce, his plans too precise. The vial in his pocket, the powder in the cellar, his weak alibi, they were like stitches in a pattern, and once you see the pattern, the rest falls into place." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her eyes wide. "But what about the others? Elise, with her cold ways, and that fussy sommelier Paul, and Henry, all grumpy and jealous. I was sure one of them might have done it." Miss Marple nodded, her needles pausing as she sipped her tea. "They each had their reasons, Clara. Elise's detachment hit a lonely heart, not a murderer's. Her visits to the artist, Marcel Fournier, were a refuge, not a plot inspector. Craddock confirmed it with the man himself. Paul's pride was wounded, but his love for the wine was too deep to taint it with poison. And Henry, for all his envy, lacked the subtlety for such a crime. Leland, though he saw Chateau Lirac as his salvation, and Vincent's refusal was his ruin. Ambition can blind a man to right and wrong. The village, in the days following Leland's confession, began to mend. Elise Moreau, now the sole owner of Chateau Lyric, announced her intention to sell the estate. She had no passion for the vines, and the village whispered that she planned to move to Paris, perhaps to pursue her art with Marcel Fournier. Henry Dubois, freed from suspicion, found new attention for his wines. As visitors, curious about the scandal, flocked to Les Vins Dubois. His gruff demeanor softened slightly, and Miss Marple heard he had even smiled at a customer, a rare event indeed. Paul Garnier, his pride intact, accepted a position at a rival winery in Bordeaux, where his expertise was already earning praise. The festival square, once a stage for tragedy, was being prepared for a harvest fair, a sign that St. Emilian's was ready to move forward. Inspector Craddock paid a final visit to the cottage, his notebook tucked away, his expression one of quiet gratitude. "You've done it again, Miss Marple," he said, accepting a cup of tea. "Leland's confessed fully signed a statement this morning. He thought he could outsmart us all, but that powder on the bottle and Pierre's testimony undid him. We're closing the case." Miss Marple's smile was warm but tinged with sorrow. "It's a sad business, Inspector," she said. "A man's life lost, a village shaken, all for a dream of wealth. But the truth has a way of coming out, like a weed in a garden. You only need to pull gently." Craddock nodded, rising to leave. "If you're ever in these parts again, Miss Marple, I'll know to expect trouble and your help solving it." Mrs. Bantry clapped her hands, nearly upsetting the teapot. "Oh, Jane, you must come back. This has been the most thrilling holiday. But now you're off to St. Mary Mead, and I suppose it'll be all quiet teas and village gossip again, Miss." Marple's eyes twinkled as she packed her knitting into her handbag. "Quiet, perhaps, Clara, but never dull. People are the same everywhere, and they always have their little secrets. I'll keep my eyes open, just in case." As she prepared to leave, Miss Marple took a final walk through St. Emilian's, her steps slow along the cobbled paths. The vineyards stretched before her, their leaves catching the light, a reminder of the life that pulsed beneath the village's surface. She paused by the fountain in the square, where Vincent had raised his fatal glass, and thought of how close the truth had been hidden in plain sight. Poison, she mused, was no match for observation, and ambition, for all its fire, could not outrun the quiet patience of justice. Back at the cottage, she closed her suitcase, her notebook tucked safely inside. Mrs. Bantry, still buzzing with excitement, hugged her tightly. "You're a marvel, Jane," she said. "St. Emilian's won't forget you." Miss Marple smiled, her expression serene. "Nor I it, Clara. But home calls, and I've a garden to tend. The train leaves at noon, and I shan't miss it." As the train pulled away from St. Emilian's, carrying Miss Marple toward St. Mary Mead, she gazed out at the passing vineyards. There rose a tapestry of green and gold. The case was closed, the pattern complete, but she knew another would soon emerge. For wherever there were people, there were stories, and Miss Marple was always ready to listen.